This is Kali Persall, editor of Institutional Investing in Infrastructure, and joining me is Josh Oboler of Palistar Capital. Today, we'll be talking about demand for data and connectivity and how it impacts mission-critical digital infrastructure that underpins the global telecommunications, media, and technology industry. So just to kick us off, Josh, why don't you give us a brief introduction of yourself and your role at Palistar?
Great, thank you, and thank you for having me. My name is Josh Oboler. I'm an investment partner at Palistar, and we are a sector-focused digital infrastructure expert. This is what we spend our time doing, buying and investing assets inside of the digital infrastructure space.
Great, thank you so much. So as you know, data usage and connectivity needs are high and they're growing for mission critical use cases. So can you discuss consumer and enterprise demand for data services?
Well, communications today are essential. They're essential for individuals and they're essential for businesses in an economy that relies on and greatly benefits from digital infrastructure and connectivity. So if you take broadband, for instance, which provides the essential connectivity really of daily life for work and business, for education, for learning, for enjoying media and connecting with friends and family, the US market today is about 40% penetrated on fiber. And we reached that point about twice as fast as it took to build the cable network in the United States when that was rolled out. And that's a result of what we see on monthly data usage. So for residential customers, they use 3 times as much data as they did in 2017. Businesses use 2.5 times as much data as they did in 2017. And we have so-called power users today that use more than a terabyte a month, and extreme power users that are almost 7 times that month. So we see very high consumer engagement, and we see end user demand growing at really high rates, really across all the subsectors. So the one example is broadband and home connections and business connections. The other is mobile and our mobile devices and our mobile phones. And if you rewind the clock 10 years, we used to use less than a gigabyte of data per month on our phones. And today we use 14 gigabytes of data per month on our phones. Over the last 3 years, the carrier networks, the major carriers in the United States, have seen an annual 30% increase in their traffic. And generally speaking, we see 20 times increases in data usage each decade. It requires a lot of investment to deliver against the customer experience. If you look at big tech's public cloud revenue, that's grown from $10 billion a quarter in 2017. Today is more than $60 billion a quarter. That's massive growth. These are massive dollars, and it's been accelerating over the last 4 quarters. So use cases do continue to evolve. Artificial intelligence, I think, is a perfect example of something that was not as active a couple of years ago and is really a market driver today. So suffice to say, there are very powerful consumption trends that support the entire digital infrastructure sector. And collectively, this aggregate network is mission critical. It's mission critical for the economy, it's mission critical to users, and it's mission critical to those delivering services to their customers.
So in terms of operator demand, can you discuss the types of initiatives that are being undertaken across the digital infrastructure landscape? I think, mobile towers, fiber, and data centers, you kind of touched on for sure fiber, but yeah, just expanding on that and how that is meeting user demand.
So I'll give you some examples of just the level and the quantum of investment that's happening, and maybe more stats and data points. If you look at the top 10 CapEx spenders in the S&P 500 in 2013, it was dominated by oil and gas companies. The large carriers were there, and there was one technology company, which was Intel. Today, the 5 largest spenders are Amazon, Microsoft, Alphabet, Meta, and Intel. And as a group, they spent $170 billion on CapEx investments in 2023. That's a remarkable shift that has gone to support data center growth and investment in digital infrastructure. New leasing in the data center space, or you could say market absorption, is now at all-time highs across the US and globally. And that's driven by AI demand and it's driven by cloud demand. And you see supply is very tight in the data center sector. If you were to look at the wireless sector, we see the five largest US wireless providers invested an average of $54 billion each year over the last 3 years to support their network and to support growth and user demand. They've invested almost $600 billion in their network since 2011, and that's before they spent almost $200 billion on spectrum rights. And then the government's also a factor. So you've got large private investment, data center companies, wireless carriers, and then the government is supporting the fiber sector with $65 billion of funding for fiber to connect rural homes and underserved communities in the United States. So very large investment from the core strategics in the space. And then we can take even a more expansive view of all of the inputs needed to drive this growth. And if you look at digital and you look at compute and the large scale resources that needs, so in the data center space, access to appropriate land is very important and access to power is very important. So there's a lot of different pieces that folks are thinking about to support this large scale capital investment to drive our mission critical communications and infrastructure needs.
It's really interesting you mentioned fiber because I just wrote a story for the i3 publication about fiber to the home. And then we have another one actually coming up in October about access to power and the demand for power and data centers and how that's being constrained. So yeah, definitely very timely. So given the high rate of network usage, this is obviously creating large demand for capital investment. How do you feel this activity is being funded, and what are some of the key considerations for infrastructure investors who are looking at mission critical digital investments?
Great, thank you. So I would say that the market has evolved over the last number of years as rates have increased, and it's created a lot of opportunity from our perspective in how we can go and create transactions in the market, work with some of the companies that I was mentioning previously. And I'll give you kind of two examples. And so the first is we clearly see the large public players driving investment in both networks and data center capacity. And along with that, there's an opportunity to create really interesting partnerships. So if you're in the right dialogue with your customers and you're considered a trusted player in the space, you can actually enter into joint ventures and sale leasebacks with strategic customers to help fund some of this growth and investment. So that's one interesting example, I think, that we've seen of how all of this CapEx activity is being funded. And then the second, I would say, is there's a willingness on the part of companies to enter into conversations that are a little bit more structured type of investments than we might have seen a couple of years ago. Preferred equity is a perfect example, and ways that you can deploy capital today in the market that are both downside protected and also allows for participation on the upside. And you can do these different types of investing, whether it's partnerships with strategics, whether it's structured types of investments, really across the subsectors. And we've seen plenty of opportunities for private investors, either to fund data centers, both the development of data centers or acquiring stabilized data center assets through platforms or through joint ventures with strategics. We see really interesting opportunities to fund fiber investments, both in a more structured, downside protected type way, as well as partnerships with strategic players through joint ventures to help them actually deliver and roll out and deploy fiber. And then on the wireless network side, there's a lot to do. There's tower development. You can acquire tower assets. There's many ways to help the carriers think about densifying their networks, both in the US market and internationally. So I would say market activity is really high today. Debt financing in our markets is open and broadly accommodating, and I would say for our sectors. When you've got mission critical assets and you've got really strong investment grade counterparties, you end up with very highly rated debt and you can get really low cost financing. And I think that's somewhat unique relative to other private sectors where digital infrastructure is a marquee downside protected, very stable long-term asset. So we see strong demand for those types of downside protected assets, kind of core and super core type assets. And then the question is, how do you drive value up and beyond the value of the contract? And how do you drive upside? And how do you drive incremental return, cash flow growth? And I think for the right teams with the right relationships, we see lots of opportunity to generate alpha And I think strong returns, particularly on a risk-adjusted basis, when you look at the strength of the underlying counterparty and contract. So all of these things we've discussed, there's this really strong macro backdrop in our sector. And the question for investors really is, how do you prioritize and sort through those opportunities and sort through those business models? And one of the keys is keeping the definition of infrastructure tight and then focusing on those mission critical assets and core strategic assets. And that allows you to create really interesting dynamics that have duration, that have durability, and an ability to grow cash flow accretively over the long term.